Welcome to our Knowledge 20 Specialist Series. You'll hear first-hand stories from organizations that are turning to KPMG-powered enterprise and ServiceNow. Stay tuned to hear how they're getting work done in new ways and applying lessons learned to drive toward the future of work.
With COVID-19 shifting to the next phase, businesses need a plan on how to re-engage with the market, their employees, and value chains. This next step will require careful planning to balance the market environment with management of people and operations. Join us as we discuss considerations to help you prepare and provide sample scenarios and frameworks to organize employee practices and operating models.
Good afternoon and welcome to today's webcast, COVID-19, What Now, What Next? My name's Steve Bates and I'm a principal in KPMG's advisory practice, and I'll be your host and moderator today. So as the world continues to move through this uncharted territory and business leaders navigate the impact of COVID-19, KPMG is continuously connecting with the market to learn and share leading practices from thousands of clients. And I want to thank you for taking time out and joining us today as we discuss considerations to help you prepare and provide some sample scenarios and frameworks for how to move forward. If you missed us last week, we had a great discussion where we covered the topics of culture being an organizational antidote for COVID and improving forecasting despite the uncertainty. It was a great dialogue. We received many questions from our audience. Let's do a quick recap of that discussion before we get started here. I took away some valuable points from each topic. From the culture discussion, when it comes to where to start on this cultural journey, we talked a lot about first defining what a great culture looks like in your organization. And that means identifying what leadership wants their people, their customers, and others to say about the organization, both during and after the crisis. Next, it's important to have both a top-down and a bottom-up approach, and that's engaging both leadership and employees in what the journey should look like. And we learned some practical and immediate ways to do that. And finally, I took away that at this time, it was time to learn and be attentive to your culture. And to do that, leadership should be clear on the organizational-wide cultural practices and behaviors they've adopted that they want to hold on to. And conversely, identify the things they were doing before that are now not so culturally important or necessary going forward. And from our forecasting discussion, I took away a couple of points. Even prior to COVID-19, there was a need to adopt different forecasting approaches, and it became really clear as we moved through the phases of rebooting business that relying on traditional internal data sets and historical scenarios is not going to be enough. We also talked about the importance of enhancing your year-to-go forecasts with multiple specific scenarios using that key internal and external data based on epidemiological data sets as well as economic and market data impact. Next, we thought it was important to link your new forecast to overall strategic modeling and continuously tune both of these models and forecasts accordingly. It seemed like it was really easy to get these out of sync. And then lastly, on a longer basis, it's important to embed a variety of these external data sets and AI techniques to support much more intelligent forecasting going forward. So a lot there, great discussion last week. Please check it out if you did miss it. But let's move on to today. I'd like to welcome our panelists, each having a deep wealth of experience working on the issues that we're talking about today, which is Restarting America, a framework to reopen business. And we have 6 panelists with Atif Saim, our leader of KPMG's Restarting America initiative. Second, we'll hear from our public policy lead, Paul Hankowski. And then we'll talk to Mike DeClaudio with an HR perspective on Restarting America. Fourth, we'll discuss the healthcare ecosystem of this initiative with Mike Beatty. Todd Lohr will share his insights on the role of technology and intelligent automation in the restart. And rounding out the panel is Tegan Keel, who will touch on how blockchain will be a key enabler to the recovery. So let's get started. So the conversation dominated in the market is about the new reality, and it's about re-engaging the economy. And with the COVID-19 dialogue starting to shift to the next phase, it's clear businesses need a plan on how to re-engage with the market, their employees, and value chains. So clearly, this next step is going to require careful planning to balance the market environment with management of people and operations. So let me start with you, Atif. As an organization that is engaged with thousands of companies, what are KPMG's thoughts on how we can reopen America?
Thank you, Steve. I apologize. I might start with a disclaimer here, and that is a number of the topics that myself and the other panelists are going to discuss here today are going to touch on areas that are medical in nature, legal, as well as employment regulations and other regulations of that nature. I just wanted to state that what we're talking about here today is really our experience of helping clients manage change, adopt different ways of working, and it's really that experience that we're bringing to bear in this conversation as opposed to providing medical advice or legal opinion. So with that out of the way, let me talk to your question about how we're thinking about it. We thought it was important when beginning on it to come up with a hypothesis. And I think it'll be helpful to just revisit that hypothesis because that's what a lot of our thinking is based on. So key components of that were we thought, again, based on what we were hearing and reports from others, that a big proportion of the U.S. population will get infected with the coronavirus. We thought as a result of some of the social distancing and shelter-in-place regulations put in place, that unemployment will get very high, and actually on that count, it was a bit of a morbid prophecy in that how quickly, unfortunately, we've seen that come to pass. So that was part of it. We didn't think that there'll be an all clear. In that it's okay for everyone to go about their business as usual or back to November 2019 until there is a discovery of a vaccine, enough manufacturing of it, distribution and administration of it. And we believe, just again based on public information, that that's some way in the distance, and depending on who you speak to, it could be measured in months or even in years. The other part of our hypothesis is that that America, or significant portions of America, so our clients, corporations, organizations, will need to go back to work in advance of that all clear getting sounded. So not just the essential workers that are working today, but a greater proportion of the workforce will need to go back to work. And we believe that there is, operating within the public health, public policy guidelines, medical guidelines, there is a risk-based approach that individual companies can adopt to slowly and iteratively open up their businesses while at the same time managing the risks posed by the virus and obviously its impacts.
So you mentioned there a risk-based approach. Can you unpack that for us a little bit? Talk a little bit more about what that would look like.
So it really has to be based on public policy, public guidance. But if you look at the public guidance available today, we believe you can take that guidance and try to get to a place where you can differentiate the types of individuals, demographics that you might be able to allow back into work sooner, so in phase one or phase two, versus others that you may not bring online until much later. There's another element of the framework which is to do with the geography. So what I mean by that is, downtown Manhattan has a slightly different risk profile as a community or as a geography than many other places in the country. And if you have a risk framework that takes into account not just the community level threat, but also the risk that the virus and its impacts pose to an individual on your workforce. A combination of those two may allow for you to reopen in a calculated manner and minimizing the risk. It's important to note that the risk obviously is not zero. As I mentioned before, the all clear really can only come after you've got that widespread vaccine or some other sort of immunity in the general population. But could you do certain things using a risk-based approach? I think that our thinking is that yes, you can. And the two key components of that risk-based approach is looking at the community threat level as well as the individual risk, the chances of an individual contracting the disease and the impact that comes from contracting that disease, as well as the opportunities for that individual or the risk of that individual to pass on or transmit that disease.
So some very good high-level framing there about these risk profiles. So prioritizing certain communities, individuals, you mentioned worker types, geographical elements, public policy, lots of different dimensions. But let's get a little more tactical into that frame. What are some of the practical steps companies can take now in reopening their businesses?
So in having a number of the client conversations as well as experience of working with companies and familiarity with their operations, Steve, we think there are 5 things that companies can start looking at now in preparation for reopening. The first one is what I already mentioned, which is this creation of and adoption of a risk framework. The second one is around workforce and workplace considerations, and Mike DeClaudia is going to talk a little bit more about that later. But essentially, workplace for us defines everything at the facility to which your workforce is going to, including the way they get there. And then workforce is obviously characteristics attributed to the individual in your workforce. The third thing is around a partner ecosystem. So if you think about the risk-based approach and you think about figuring out which elements of the workforce you're able to bring in earlier than others, there's potentially information that you may need to make that determination, that is to distinguish between which workers you're able to let in versus the ones that need to come later. Assuming you get past some of the hurdles around, can you get that information, should you get that information, the legal, employment law issues concerning that, you then have to decide how will you get that information, who will keep that information, and how do you protect some pretty sensitive PHI type information. And this is really where an ecosystem comes in, so that your medical providers, your payers, health insurance company that you work with, et cetera, what role do they have to play in creating this ecosystem for you that you can then use? So that's number 3. Number 4 is around technology enablement. As we've thought through the various steps that you need to take, both in terms of analysis of what you require in the workforce, as well as some additional steps that you might do in the workplace. So extra cleaning and what have you. All of those things are new, mostly new processes, and at any reasonable scale, I think very hard to do manually. So having a technology strategy as to how you answer those or automate those new processes is going to be key, and we believe you need to start thinking about that now. And the fifth is, and you could have argued that we could have started with this, is around program governance. This is new. This has some very high risks associated with it. It impacts not just one department or function within your company. It impacts, frankly, the entire country. But within the 4 walls of your company, you need to have a governance mechanism that can bring in the right C-level engagement. It can get the monitoring and coordination between all the different functions within the business, and frankly, from outside the business, right? A number of the questions that you're going to be faced with as you think through this is going to require help from the outside. So you probably do need to consult medical professionals outside of your company. You probably need to consider legal opinions, particularly around as it relates getting information, personal health information from employees. So, Steve, those are the 5 steps that I see, that we see companies can start taking now to prepare to reopen their businesses.
So thanks for setting the stage there, Atif. And let's spend the rest of our conversation then exploring some of these elements you just mentioned: workplace, workforce, new partner ecosystem, new levels of technology enablement, program governance. Just a reminder to the audience, you're able to submit questions at any time throughout the webcast by using that Ask a Question box on the left-hand side of your webcast player, and we'll get to those in the second half of our session. Paul, let me bring you in here. So Atif mentioned the public policy elements that are going to need to be considered inside this risk-based framework. Can you talk to us a little bit more about those dimensions?
Yeah, absolutely, Steve, and thanks for hosting today. The public policy considerations are really complicated. Public policy leaders at the federal, state, and local level have a real challenge here. There are a couple different frameworks that they could, or elements that they could look to base a public policy on. What we hear a lot about in the media and in the news is about testing-based strategies, whether we're talking about infection testing or antibody testing. The issues with both of those strategies is one of capacity, primarily. If you look at infection testing today, the U.S. can test just about 200,000 people a day. We have 321 million Americans. Obviously, it doesn't take a CPA to figure out that 200,000 with 321 million Americans is not going to be sufficient. On the side of antibody testing, those tests are still really being developed. And while they're being tested, and there are some trials that we hear about in the media, they are not yet at scale, and it will take some time to get to scale. In addition, if we're talking about infection testing, the issue with that, even if we had the scale to test every American, is that all that does is give you a point-in-time reference as to whether or not somebody is or is not infected. It doesn't tell you what happens the minute they walk out of that testing lab and come to somebody else, come into contact with somebody else. On the side of antibodies, it's going to take some time before researchers fully understand that if you have the antibodies, how much immunity does it give you, and for how long? So you can understand, Steve, some of the limitations with that. So what we've developed is a public policy framework that is flexible, it's dynamic, and it's risk-based. And it considers testing along with other factors such as demographic and social. It provides policymakers, whether that be at a government level or within an organization like a business that's looking to reopen, the opportunity to decide what risk elements they're going to rely upon in order to make a determination as to whether or not it is safe, quote unquote, for somebody to come back into the office or to otherwise to enter a business or otherwise re-enter society. Just to expand, Atif talked a little bit about it at the top, and I just want to expand on some of those elements a little bit, because there are really 3 primary elements to the risk-based framework that we're talking about. We issued an issue brief on this on April 14th that we encourage folks to go and take a look at, that we're currently dialoguing with many of our government clients with. But one is the community threat level. This is really important. What we're doing is using the federal guidelines that were published on April 16th, actually, just a couple days after we published the issue brief, to look at some factors that would indicate the level of prevalence of the virus within a given community. That's really important for our clients that are operating businesses to understand that the risk is different in the different locations that they might be serving. Then the other element to look at is the risk to the individual. And as Atif mentioned, that's the risk to contract a serious illness or the risk to transmit the virus if they were exposed to it. And there are a number of factors that we know influence that. In terms of the risk to contract a serious illness, demographic factors such as age, such as the existence of any pre-existing conditions, all weigh into that. There are other social factors. What type of a job does somebody have? What type of living arrangement do they have? Do they live in a densely populated area or in a more rural area? How do they travel to work? Is it via public transportation or in their own private automobile? These are all factors that policymakers could consider in terms of determining somebody's risk to contract a serious illness. In terms of risk to transmit, it's a little bit more cut and dry, because basically everybody is a risk to transmit the virus unless they have signs of antibodies within their system. And even with that, as I mentioned earlier, it's a little bit unknown how much immunity does in fact protect against the risk to transmit. There'll be some time before researchers are able to give us a little bit of a clear guidance. But if you look at the individual risk and you compare it against the risk within the community, that community threat level I mentioned earlier, you can then start to implement a more nuanced approach to reopening businesses, to reopening society. That's the type of framework, Steve, that we're talking about with our clients within the state and local governments and at the federal level. And it is also a framework that our business clients could implement within their organizations.
So, Paul, really thorough explanation there. You talked about the framework providing support, especially right now for government and public policymakers. Can you quickly tell us about how that same framework you mentioned could be implemented within a corporate setting?
Absolutely. You know, the same elements of risk that we're talking about apply within a business just as easily as they do within a society. So, number one is, business leadership is going to have to make some determinations about the type of business that they have, what the work environment is like, how much contact there is with the public. Obviously, office-based businesses versus consumer retail businesses, they present different risks. But you can consider all of those risks when determining which risk factors to include in the algorithm that we've developed. And then based on that, you can make determinations about which locations can open and under what conditions. Is it a case of only essential employees, or is it employees that can be accommodated with appropriate social distancing guidelines? You can also make determinations as to what types of individuals you can, if you do have, for example, a consumer retail business or a restaurant or a hotel, for example, how do you determine who is safe to allow into your business? I think a little bit later in our conversation here, Steve Todd's going to talk about an underlying technology platform that we've developed that could that an individual could use to assess their own level of risk, to input information about any test results that they have received, and based on the results of an algorithm that, again, could be configured by a government public policymaker or by a business to issue what we're calling a COVID passport. And this is, I want to be very clear, this is not, an immunity passport, because nobody can really say definitively who is or is not immune. But what this passport can provide is an indication of what level of relative risk a particular individual may have based on the community they live in, based on their work situation, and based on their own demographic characteristics, while keeping those sensitive pieces of information secure and private to the individual, and only presenting at the end the results of the algorithm.
So that's a really, again, very comprehensive view. There's so many different angles that I think that we're going to have to look at, and a place to refer to this framework. We'll share those resources later in our post-event follow-up. But key takeaways: which workers can return to work in what circumstances, again, across considering what the community threat levels, individuals' medical profile, what public policy guidance have here. It's really, really interesting stuff. Mike DeClaudio, let's bring you in here. Paul just talked a lot about what the future is for individuals in the workplace. How do you see this impacting the future of work? And specifically, are there any employee relation issues that companies should bear in mind when restarting?
Sure. Thanks, Steve. So the short answer is it's accelerating the future of work. We're having conversations with organizations who 3 or 4 months ago were talking about a 3 or 5 year workforce transformation, and are now talking about a 6-month workforce transformation. And that's not just the teleworking, virtual work environment conversation. We're having kind of much broader dialogues with both CHROs and business leaders around, Are these the types of skills that I need in my business based on what my business is ultimately going to be? Do I need those skills to be in a brick and mortar environment that I own or I lease? Or are they virtual environments? Do they need to be my employees, or can they be someone else's employees? And finally, arguably the thing that this has accelerated the most in addition to virtual work is automation. Looking at kind of manufacturing lines and understanding the opportunities for automation, both there as well as in the knowledge space. Where am I automating work that otherwise had been done by a human in the past? So to the first question, it's accelerating it at a very rapid clip. I think the general consensus is organizations are not returning to a 2019 work type. They're going to be returning to a 2020, 2021 work type, and that's going to be a very different kind of mix of skills and labor. On the employee relations front, there's both Paul and Atif mentioned, and you're going to hear Mike talk about in a bit. There is a federal kind of guidance, there's state guidance, there's local guidance. What we're seeing organizations do is both do the best that they can and everything that they can to, in many cases, adopt and even expand on those guidelines. We're seeing an opportunity, thinking about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we're seeing an opportunity to use workplace safety and worker safety as a differentiator on the employment side. So you're talking about, and this is sort of harkening back to the previous webcast and talking about culture as an antidote, really viewing value that you're giving to your employees as the differentiator. And our data is even showing that conversations that we have with clients are kind of tied to value that employees have and employees feel that their employees extend, are faring through this crisis much better than organizations where maybe they haven't focused so much on value and culture. So for us, there's certainly going to be employee relations challenges. Atif's safe harbor statement holds true. We aren't lawyers. It's going to be tough for us to give you kind of strict guidance there. I would seek to try to find ways to differentiate on the employee experience, try to find ways to extend that value to your employees, let them know kind of where you care, and use some of the risk frameworks that we're talking about in a very transparent way. That seems to be the most agreed to path forward right now, Steve.
And Mike, I think there's an opportunity here around that, as we return to normal, you said that, there's going to be this new reality of you're going to be looking at a, 2020 environment. And I think that there's an element of differentiation that the employers that get this, take this seriously, will be able to retain and attract the right talent going forward. This is going to be part of their DNA. So really good stuff. Thank you for that. Yeah, Mike Beatty, let's turn to you. We've talked in several of our previous episodes about the importance for using a broad variety of demographic and health data in assessing risk, managing workplace safety. We talked a lot about that. So can you quickly talk to us about why are we suggesting like a healthcare ecosystem approach is needed now to solve this challenge?
Sure, Steve, and I'll talk through this point quickly so we can keep going. But if you think about data, healthcare data about a person's healthcare status, that is protected under multiple layers of regulatory guidance. And so most large employers, corporate environments, defer to other parties to manage that data where needed. Think of your relationship with your payer. This situation is no different. All of the COVID requirements that we've been talking about here are not natural. They're not normal state of business. And so having a partnership with people that can help accelerate your solution and sustain it over time, because this may go on for 1 to 2 years, is a really important piece of the puzzle. So thinking about data management is a good example, thinking about your testing infrastructure, how and who and where and at what speed and pace can I partner with someone out in the community to provide testing. Providers in my communities, we've for years talked about direct contracting and direct relationships with providers. This is a really good time to think about that, to provide that safety net of care for your employees that might need care or testing related to COVID. I think guidance on things like social distancing and management of PPE in the corporate environment are really not natural skills that most have either. And so leaning on experts from a healthcare perspective or a healthcare supply chain perspective that can help you think through how to not only design but implement, maintain over a long period of time is going to be really important as well. And so you think about what I just described, that might be 2, 3, or 4 partners that are not a part of your current system that you need to be out seeking today and thinking about relationships with for the next 1 to 2 years as this COVID pandemic plays out.
I think that's a really hidden insight of what's coming into this new reality. Many companies are going to need to accelerate building on really non-traditional supply chain relationships and making sure that there are connections across employees and health systems and other suppliers and partners that are going to need to be involved now in managing these new workplace safety requirements. So I think that's a really interesting point that we should focus on. Todd, let me pivot to you. Based on everything we've heard thus far, we know technology, especially around things like automation, integrated digital solutions, they're going to be a key enabler, right, to restart and reopen the economy. Talk to us a little bit about how we're envisioning technology's role in getting the workforce back to work and enable these policies.
Great, thanks, Steve. So as Paul alluded to, tech's going to have a huge role in the actual enablement of the policy framework that Paul discussed. So be able to deploy a technology through employers to the workforce to really do a number of different things. So if you think about the application that we've built to date, it's really meant to be deployed to the workforce broadly, to be able to capture some of that initial data. I know a number of employers have already started to capture data, are sending forms out there, but really having an application that's mobile enabled to capture initial data and everything from personal information, health markers, location information, commuting information, all of the things that would go into the risk model and the policy discussions and frameworks that Paul spoke to. So, first and foremost, it's getting an application out there that can help enable and digitize that capture of initial data to understand the workforce. Next, it's using that data, as Paul said, within that risk model or the policy framework to be able to provide dynamic scoring of the risk. And then using that risk, using an algorithm to be able to push, that passport concept that Paul spoke about and issue the passport that dynamically changes as the risk changes, as policy changes, as the science changes, locations change, et cetera. So being able to provide that passport concept in a digital wallet, leveraging the technology that folks have on their devices today, to be able to then give them permission where they're going to, how they're going to reenter the workforce, what permissions they're going to have, where they're going to go. In a public setting, what areas can they go to? Paul gave an example of restaurants, sporting events. But specifically from an employee context, what office can you go to? Can you travel to different parts? How can you fluidly do some jobs versus others? So using that passport construct within the overall risk framework to digitally enable the workforce to return to work in a mitigated way. And then ultimately, the application we've built also has elements of monitoring, right? So everything from having connected devices to understand as conditions change, asking you new questions, ultimately connecting, different sensors, whether it's heart rate, blood pressure, oxygen sensors, et cetera, to be able to monitor the workforce in real time, but then also in integrating contact tracing. So understanding if something does happen, how do you understand where that person has been interacting with and who they've been interacting with to be able to stay on top of it from an employee perspective. All of this then, obviously, the application itself is creating a massive amount of data that can then be rolled up into a control center that allows employers to understand, in real time, the wellness of their workforce, being able to make policy decisions around how they make and enact, certain office openings, closures, changes in policies, sanitization requests, et cetera, being able to have that live, real-time connectivity to the workforce. So underpinning all of those applications and what we've built is really a couple different concepts that I think are going to be key for all employers to think about as folks return to workplace and using technology. One is going to be human-centered design. So thinking about the uncertainty of the times, what's that causing for the employees, and then really thinking about the technology to be able to help drive the connectivity, the experience that makes them feel better as much as possible about, making that return to the workforce. So that's going to be critical and something that we've thought about in our application we've built to date. The other big key consideration for companies is privacy and security. As you can imagine, and talking about, some of the the data that would need to be collected and some of the policy discussion that was had previously in the call, it's going to be critical to have your arms around, the privacy, the security, and how you build the technology to be able to enable that, and to give that, sense that sense to your employees of how that information is being used, going back to the human-centered component of this. The other thing that's going to be key from a technology perspective is really building for change and having interoperability. This is a very dynamic market from a tech perspective. There are a lot of technologies coming online, a lot of different ways to think about this. Policies are going to change, so being able to decouple some of the technology constructs using a number of technologies, putting it in the cloud, having a vast ecosystem of partners, leveraging low-code applications. Essentially the technology landscape here is going to leverage all of the emerging technologies we see, everything from the low-code, as I mentioned, to be able to build for change, data and analytics, artificial intelligence, integration layers, and blockchain to address some of the privacy and security concerns.
It sounds like you're really talking about a whole new set of architectural considerations. I mean, you talked about digital wallet and passport, is this huge amount of data generation and that rolling up to an AI-powered control center, while still dealing with privacy and security issues. So getting this connected enterprise, this front, middle, and back all working together, is not just about making sure that the workforce isn't able to put in policies, but I mean, there's a whole bunch of this around actually the operation side of the equation. How about the emerging tech in there about enabling the operating environment going forward, not just the employee enablement side?
Yeah, so from an emerging tech perspective, like I said, I think you're going to see a number of technologies that they're going to have to go into these systems. So as I referenced, you're going to be looking at a whole host of the technologies across the end-to-end solutions and being able to leverage those in the build. And quite frankly, partnering with a number of the large technology organizations out there that are bringing technology to the market.
Right. So, Tegan, let's bring you into the conversation. Following on what Todd just covered, again, there's a lot of base technology as well as emerging tech playing a big role in this recovery. Let's take a specific example. What do you think blockchain has to have play here?
Yeah, so I think as Todd mentioned, I think one key component of where blockchain fits in here is around the idea of identity and privacy and security, right? So obviously any health data like test results or risk score fall into sort of a very sensitive piece of information about a person that then requires very special handling from an individual as well as an organizational perspective. And this becomes sort of paramount when the context of that sharing extends beyond the boundaries of just employer and employee, where there's a little bit more of an implied consent there. So one of the ways that blockchain is able to support this concept of self-sovereign identity is using advanced cryptography concepts like zero-knowledge proofs that help enable segregation of certain data attributes that I may want or need to share, like the fact that I'm over 21, from underlying personal information, like my exact date of birth. And from an organization perspective, this sort of helps avoid the burden of having to manage that personal information because it's sitting with the individual, not with the organization. And then they don't sort of subsequently have to worry about cybersecurity risks and compliance with GDPR or other privacy regulations necessarily. And then secondly, I think the other way that blockchain fits in here, which is probably a little bit more obvious, is to help create a transparent and unalterable history of all relevant events, whether it's needing to prove that an organization had consent to verify a health result, or that all the cleaning procedures as defined in a return to work program were executed as required.
So a lot of very good insight in there around, especially as it relates to two parties being involved in order to effectively, manage identity, underlying health data securely, creating that auditable history of data sharing, that immutable ledger you talked about. So blockchain clearly going to play a role in this going forward. Panelists, that is a ton of very good advice from so many different perspectives. I'm going to quickly try to sum up what I've heard as some of the most valuable takeaways from this discussion. I came away with this 5-step risk-based approach, supported, of course, by a bunch of modern technology solutions. And your guidance is you're going to gradually, safely reopen your business, and you're going to have to continue to control that threat, have transparency. And those key elements is you got to have a risk framework, right? And it's going to have to be informed by both public policy as well as medical and health guidance. And organizations should be able to use this framework to determine which workers can return to work in what circumstances. You also have to look at that workplace and those workforce considerations and formulate policies that govern both the timeline and the place of the workplace reopening and employees returning, about what are the essential jobs, and also re-engaging with customers. And you're going to do that in the context of trying to align to the limited guidance from federal, state, and local mandates around workload practices. You also talked about establishing a new supply chain, a new partner ecosystem for organizations that have to be able to link employees, providers of healthcare services, and the suppliers that are going to manage new workplace safety requirements. And for a lot of organizations, that's a brand new concept. And then on the technology level, that you're going to have to start assessing, considering much broader technology capabilities to support a restart program, very specifically getting transparency around the workforce, the risk elements to it, and the economic considerations to be integrated into a dashboard. And the last point that we heard was around emerging tech, like incorporating blockchain. Again, it's a key component to getting work programs started where more than two parties are involved in trying to share information around a complex situation. And then wrapping all of that, what the chief talked to us about is you're going to have a much more robust agile governance process. And you're going to have to be able to make decisions based on clarity and getting transparency into this. If you don't have those clear protocols and communication, it's going to be difficult to navigate that. Tons of good stuff there. So great advice. This is just the opening in what will be, I'm sure, a very long dialogue between us and our listeners. Again, I want to thank you, our panelists. You shared a lot of great information. Listeners, if you'd like further information, feel free to contact any one of us using the contact information there you see on your screen. And again, thanks for your participation. Any more information from KPMG on these topics, you can find them on the URL on your screen.
Thank you for joining us. We look forward to bringing you additional insights, lessons learned, and much more as we continue the ServiceNow Knowledge 20 digital experience. In the meantime, learn more by visiting us at visit.kpmg.us/K20digital.